I knew the exact moment I became furniture in the eyes of executive management. It was not when they shifted my workstation into the claustrophobic corner next to the primary server rack to make room for a custom espresso bar and a pink ping-pong table. And it was not when the newly appointed vice president of brand strategy tapped me on the shoulder to ask if I was the internal IT technician responsible for clearing paper jams in the executive suite printer. It happened at the Series C celebration dinner held at an extravagant steakhouse in downtown Boston. They were popping bottle after bottle of vintage Dom Perignon as though it flowed straight from the municipal water supply, loudly toasting to the visionary brilliance of Nexus Analytics Incorporated. Meanwhile, our charismatic founder, Landon Vance, stood atop a plush leather booth soaked in champagne, screaming to the entire dining room about how he single-handedly revolutionized the predictive commerce industry. I sat quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table, nursing a lukewarm club soda with a slice of lime, watching a room full of sharp suits celebrate a complex technological machine that not a single one of them knew how to operate or maintain. People outside the high-tech sector operate under the romantic delusion that successful technology startups are forged purely out of visionary inspiration, boundless courage, and late-night caffeine. They are not. They are built on dry, meticulously drafted legal paperwork that arrogant executives rarely bother to read because they are far too busy calculating their personal net worth in the reflective tint of penthouse windows. 8 years ago, long before the sleek glass partition walls, the artisan microbrews on tap, and the branded fleece vests, Nexus Analytics was nothing more than 2 folding chairs and a single, battered laptop in a damp Cambridge basement that smelled persistently of mildew, stale pepperoni pizza, and desperate ambition. I authored the core predictive engine completely from scratch, a proprietary neural network architecture that currently processes hundreds of thousands of customer transactions per second and generates 90% of this company's total annual recurring revenue. Landon provided the theatrical sales pitches, the slick networking, and the grandiose promises to early angel investors. I provided the underlying mathematical logic and the fault-tolerant software architecture. Back during those chaotic early months, when we were formally incorporating the commercial business entity, Landon was in a constant state of manic excitement. He rushed through legal documents, signing corporate papers without so much as glancing at the body text, his eyes perpetually fixed on imaginary billions. I was built differently. I was a 49-year-old software architect with an extensive postdoctoral research background in algorithmic design, a healthy skepticism of corporate promises, and a mountain of personal debt that looked like an international telephone number. I had watched too many brilliant engineers get diluted into absolute irrelevance by ruthless venture capitalists and slick co-founders. I did not care about holding paper equity that could be easily diluted or manipulated through complex corporate restructuring. I wanted absolute, unassailable structural leverage. So, tucked neatly inside the thick leather binder of incorporation documents, sandwiched inconspicuously between the standard corporate bylaws and the customary non-competes, I included a single legal document. It was titled an Intellectual Property Lease Agreement, structured strictly under federal copyright statutes, including Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. The contract stated in plain, unambiguous legal phrasing that I, Grant Miller, retained full, exclusive, and unencumbered personal ownership of the predictive logic source code version 1.0 and all subsequent algorithmic derivatives. Furthermore, it specified that I was leasing this proprietary logic to Nexus Analytics Incorporated for the nominal fee of $1 per year. The lease agreement was renewable annually upon payment, but contained a crucial, non-negotiable clause. It was terminable unilaterally by the licensor myself, with 30 days written notice if the annual lease fee was defaulted on or if the contract was not formally executed and renewed by corporate officers. Landon signed the contract with a theatrical flourish, using an expensive Mont Blanc fountain pen he could not actually afford at the time, all while rambling endlessly to an investor on the phone regarding industry paradigm shifts. He did not read a single line. Nobody on his makeshift legal team bothered to inspect it either. For 8 consecutive years, I quietly paid myself that $1 out of the office petty cash drawer, carefully filed the stamped physical receipt in my personal bank safe deposit box, and unilaterally renewed the lease agreement. I remained the indispensable ghost in the corporate machine. I maintained the code base, patched critical security vulnerabilities, optimized database queries, and scaled the distributed cloud infrastructure while Landon appeared on national tech podcasts to pontificate about market synergy and artificial intelligence innovation. However, the internal atmosphere within the company shifted dramatically 6 months ago. Nexus Analytics grew too large for its own good, transitioning into what corporate venture capital partners glibly refer to as operational maturity. The early engineering culture of mutual respect evaporated, replaced almost overnight by toxic corporate ladder climbing and aggressive posturing. I ceased being respected as the founding architect and began to be viewed as an outdated operational liability. I did not fit the desired corporate aesthetic. I did not play weekend golf with board members. I had zero interest in attending mandatory team-building retreats in the desert to brainstorm inspirational mission statements. I simply wanted to write clean, robust, high-performance code. Sitting at that Series C banquet dinner, watching Landon high-five a newly hired executive whose entire career seemed built on teeth whitening and unearned confidence, a cold, serene clarity settled over my mind. These executives looked at me and saw a middle-aged engineer in a plain cotton sweater who happened to be around in the early days. They had no idea they were looking at their landlord, and the annual rent was about to fall due. The disconnect between their arrogant perception and actual legal reality was almost comedic. They were drinking expensive champagne to celebrate the ripe fruit of the tree, entirely oblivious to the fact that I held sole legal title to the soil, the deep roots, and the irrigation rights. Late that evening, after the noisy banquet concluded, I returned to the deserted office headquarters. I did not go back to work on routine feature updates. Instead, I unlocked the fireproof physical filing cabinet situated in the back archive room. Tucked behind stacks of old corporate tax forms was the original, slightly yellowed lease agreement, complete with Landon's jagged signature in dark blue ink. I created a high-resolution digital scan, uploaded it to a private encrypted cloud server, backed it up on an offline physical drive, and then returned home to wait for the inevitable corporate storm. I knew a formal confrontation was coming, though I did not anticipate it would arrive wearing custom designer sneakers, a tailored blazer, and a patronizing grin named Gideon Ross. Gideon was the newly installed Chief Technology Officer, brought in by the Venture Capital Board to provide our engineering department with what they termed modern executive leadership. Gideon was the absolute quintessence of corporate fluff, a man who unironically utilized buzzwords like paradigm shift, hyperscalability, and AI-native frameworks in casual conversation. He boasted a Master of Business Administration degree from an expensive institution, but a thorough review of his public software repositories revealed a complete absence of actual coding contributions. On his very first morning, Gideon summoned a mandatory engineering assembly, clapped his hands together enthusiastically, and grandly declared that we were going to completely overhaul our legacy infrastructure and pivot to a distributed microservices frameworks driven by generative frameworks. I felt a familiar tension tighten behind my left eye. The existing production architecture was already fully distributed and microservice-driven. I had engineered it that way 5 years prior. Individuals of Gideon's archetype do not analyze technical reality. They merely echo trending industry buzzwords to justify their inflated executive salaries. On Tuesday afternoon, Gideon summoned me into his corner glass office, the kind of transparent enclosure designed explicitly to ensure the entire engineering floor can observe employee discipline. He did not invite me to sit down. He leaned casually against the edge of his standing desk, crossing his arms in a practiced power pose. "Grant, hey, we really appreciate all the heavy lifting you did on the legacy codebase during the early bootstrap years," Gideon began, his tone dripping with condescension. "But we are bringing in a fresh team of senior developers to construct the Nexus 2.0 architecture. We need younger energy and modern methodologies. You understand how fast the technology landscape moves. I wrote the core predictive engine from the ground up, Gideon, I replied, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. If you alter the data ingestion pipeline without accounting for the underlying neural mapping, you will compromise the predictive precision. Historical client data will fail to validate across nodes. He waved his hand dismissively, as though brushing aside a minor inconvenience. That is precisely why we are transitioning you into an advisory role. We want you to focus entirely on documentation. Write down all that tribal knowledge stored in your head and hand over the root administrative credentials to our new lead developers so they can drive the bus forward. We are creating a specialized title for you, Head of Legacy Maintenance. It is a vital position. Head of Legacy Maintenance was corporate nomenclature for a glorified janitor. He wanted me to write the instruction manual for my own replacement, sit quietly in a dark corner, and resolve system bugs while he claimed full credit for modernizing our core platform. I studied his polished demeanor and his expensive luxury watch. He genuinely believed he was putting an aging worker out to pasture. He had no inkling that he was speaking to the legal owner of the entire enterprise. I understand your structural objective, I said smoothly. You require comprehensive documentation of all intellectual property, along with full root administrative access transfer. Exactly, Gideon smiled warmly, convinced he had easily subdued me. Love the team-first attitude. Take a few weeks to compile the system architecture documentation, but ensure the new engineering leads have full administrative credentials by Friday afternoon. I stepped out of his office with a profound sense of calm determination. For the first time in years, I felt entirely focused. I returned to my desk and initiated a thorough corporate audit. However, I was not writing developer guides for Gideon's hires. I was compiling an unassailable dossier of corporate infringement. I extracted system access logs spanning the past 8 years, downloaded commit histories, and documented every single instance where Landon, Gideon, or the board had explicitly represented my proprietary engine as corporate-owned technology in private pitch decks and public investor filings. Then, I conducted a precise audit of our physical legal records. The annual lease renewal for the predictive source code was required to be formally executed and paid on October 1st. It was currently October 15th. The corporate officers had completely overlooked the renewal deadline. They had failed to remit the annual $1 licensing fee. Under the explicit terms of the contract, the lease had officially defaulted 2 weeks prior. From a legal standpoint, Nexus Analytics Incorporated had been operating its core commercial platform on unlicensed, stolen intellectual property for 14 straight days. I maintained total silence. Later that week, Toby Albright, a conscientious junior developer who was one of the few engineers to actually ask thoughtful questions about underlying system design, approached my workstation. He looked around nervously before speaking in a hushed tone. "Grant, can I ask you something off the record?" Toby whispered. At the engineering strategy meeting this morning, Gideon presented the core predictive module to the engineering team. He claimed he personally architected the base logic during an intense weekend coding session. But when I reviewed the repository commit history, the underlying mathematical algorithms are identical to your original work. He literally just renamed the internal variables, changing user velocity to customer journey speed. I listened quietly as my suspicions were confirmed. Gideon was not merely attempting to sideline me. He was actively plagiarizing my life's work to secure his standing with the board of directors. "I appreciate you bringing this matter to my attention, Toby," I said calmly. "Keep your focus on your assignments and do not engage in any arguments with management. I am handling the situation appropriately." Gideon's blatant plagiarism transformed a professional dispute into a matter of absolute corporate accountability. It was no longer simply about financial compensation. It was about exposing systemic corporate arrogance. That evening, leveraging my administrative clearance, which no one had remembered to revoke, I conducted a deep inspection of executive directory files. I discovered a restricted folder labeled Project Titan. Project Titan represented a landmark commercial agreement with North America's largest retail conglomerate. A contract valued at $200 million over 5 years. The initial pilot deployment was scheduled to launch in exactly 3 weeks. As I carefully reviewed the technical specifications guaranteed to the client, my jaw set. Nexus Analytics had explicitly warranted that it possessed full, unencumbered, and exclusive ownership of all underlying software algorithms, including real-time inventory adaptation models and behavioral prediction systems. They were white-labeling my personal intellectual property and selling it as their own proprietary asset to a third-party corporation. I spent the entire weekend running line-by-line differential comparisons between the original source code I had authored in that damp basement 8 years ago and the codebase currently deployed on the Titan production servers. The result was a 98% structural match. They had not even taken the time to remove my original code comments from 2015, which contained personal reminders and mathematical notes. Gideon's grand new architecture was nothing more than a superficial user interface wrapper slapped over my core algorithm. On Monday morning, I scheduled a private consultation with Clara Jenkins, a senior intellectual property litigation attorney in downtown Boston, known for her ruthless courtroom efficiency. We met in a quiet conference room away from the financial district. I laid out the complete documentation: the original 1915 IP lease agreement, the record of missed annual payments, the evidence of internal plagiarism, and the signed Project Titan commercial contract. Clara reviewed the documents carefully, checking the clause references under federal copyright statutes. As she reached the final page of the Titan agreement, a sharp smile appeared on her face. "Grant, this is not merely a breach of contract," Clara said, setting the papers down. "This is absolute legal checkmate." Nexus Analytics built a multi-million-dollar corporate valuation on top of an asset they do not own. By missing the annual renewal payment, their license terminated automatically 14 days ago. Every single transaction processed through your engine since October 1st constitutes intentional copyright infringement under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. Furthermore, representing to client partners and Series D investors that the company holds exclusive title to this technology constitutes material misrepresentation and potential securities fraud. "What is our immediate legal tactical play?" I asked. "Absolute tactical patience," Clara advised firmly. "Allow them to proceed with their Series D board presentation. Let them commit their misrepresentations to writing in front of their primary venture capital investors. The further they commit themselves to deploying your intellectual property without a valid license, the absolute maximum leverage you retain. When we strike, it will not be a polite warning letter. It will be an existential corporate event." Over the following 10 days, I maintained a completely composed demeanor at the office. Gideon occasionally dropped by my workstation to check on the progress of my legacy documentation, offering shallow encouragement while reminding me that root credential transfer was expected by Friday. I assured him with total calm that every single line of code was being systematically cataloged and attributed to its true origin. Meanwhile, the executive calendar confirmed that the formal Series D finalization meeting was scheduled for the upcoming Tuesday. Nexus Analytics was preparing to secure $50 million in fresh venture capital at a total corporate valuation of $400 million. The investment syndicate was led by top-tier firms from Sand Hill Road, accompanied by senior corporate legal counsel Taft Vance. The investors had submitted rigorous due diligence questionnaires asking the corporate officers to explicitly certify that Nexus Analytics possessed 100% unencumbered ownership of all core technological assets. Landon and Gideon had already checked yes on every single question. They were walking directly into a trap of their own creation, blinded by greed and supreme overconfidence. They viewed me as an obsolete employee who could be discarded without consequence. They had no comprehension that the entire corporate edifice rested on a foundation they had leased for $1 a year and subsequently forgotten to maintain. On Tuesday morning, the corporate boardroom on the top floor presented a picture of extravagant executive success. The massive mahogany table offered sweeping views of the Charles River. Seated around it were Landon Vance, Gideon Ross, lead venture capital partners from California wearing sleek fleece vests, and corporate legal counsel Taft Vance, who was casually skimming through final closing binders. I did not wait for an invitation to enter. Under the explicit terms of the 1915 Intellectual Property Lease Agreement, the licensor retains the unconditional right to conduct an immediate on-site audit of software compliance upon notice. I walked straight into the boardroom carrying my leather briefcase, completely calm and impeccably prepared. Landon immediately scowled, slamming his pen onto the table. "Grant, what is the meaning of this intrusion? We are in the middle of a confidential Series D closing session. Engineering updates are not on the executive agenda today." I walked to the head of the boardroom table, standing directly adjacent to Taft Vance, and placed my laptop onto the presenter dock. "This is not an engineering update, Landon," I said, my voice steady and resonant throughout the room. "This is a mandatory intellectual property compliance audit. Before this board executes documents securing $50 million in venture capital, there is a fundamental title discrepancy regarding the core platform that must be formally addressed." One of the lead venture capital partners narrowed his eyes, looking up from his tablet. "What does title discrepancy mean?" "Landon, I thought your legal counsel verified that all core technology was fully owned under standard employee assignment agreements." Taft Vance stepped forward defensively. "Our corporate assignment forms are completely ironclad. All internal code authored by employees belongs entirely to Nexus Analytics Incorporated. That statement is legally inaccurate," I replied calmly, pressing a key to project my presentation onto the main wall displays. Slide 1 appeared on the wall, a crisp, high-resolution scan of the original intellectual property lease agreement, executed 8 years prior. 8 years ago, prior to the formal incorporation of this entity, I created the core predictive algorithm, I explained to the room of stunned investors. Under federal copyright law, I retained absolute personal ownership of the source code and executed a strict lease agreement with Nexus Analytics Incorporated for $1 per year. The company was granted a limited, conditional license to utilize the code, contingent upon annual formal renewal and timely payment. Gideon jumped out of his chair, his face flushed with panic. "This is completely absurd. This is an ancient piece of paper from the basement days." He signed an employment contract later that superseded everything. I clicked to slide 2, which displayed the explicit legal timeline alongside relevant statutory provisions. The lease agreement explicitly predates my employment contract and specifically excludes the underlying core engine from corporate assignment, I stated, looking directly at Taft Vance. Furthermore, Section 4 of the agreement dictates that failure to remit the annual lease fee or execute the annual renewal by October 1st results in immediate default and automatic termination of the license. Nexus Analytics failed to make the required payment on October 1st. As of 14 days ago, the corporate license expired completely. The silence in the boardroom was instantaneous and absolute. Taft Vance frantically began flipping through his legal due diligence binders, his hands visibly trembling as he located the original incorporation schedule. He stared at the signed document, his face draining of all color. "Taft," Landon demanded, his voice cracking with rising panic. "Tell them this is nonsense. Tell them we own the code." Taft looked up slowly, his expression hollow. "Landon, did you sign this document in 2015? "Of course I signed it." Landon spat angrily. "I signed hundreds of startup papers back then. It was just routine paperwork. It does not mean anything." "It means everything," Taft whispered, turning to the venture capital partners. "If this lease agreement was executed prior to entity formation and was never formally bought out or assigned, Grant Miller retains personal title to the core architecture. If the lease expired 2 weeks ago due to non-payment, the company is currently operating its primary commercial service without legal authorization." I clicked to slide 3, displaying the detailed technical audit of Project Titan. Nexus Analytics has executed a $200 million commercial contract with a national retail partner, guaranteeing exclusive ownership of technology it does not legally control, I said coldly. Deploying unlicensed software under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, exposes this firm to statutory damages of up to $150,000 per willful infringement instance. Furthermore, certifying to Series D investors that the company holds exclusive title constitutes material securities misrepresentation, Landon snapped completely. He slammed both palms onto the mahogany table, shouting across the room. "We built this company. You are just a coder. You are a middle-aged technician who sat in the back room while I built a unicorn. You do not own anything." I looked at him with absolute detachment and calmly spoke the words that redefined our dynamic. "Actually, Landon, according to federal copyright law and this signed assignment, I own the entire mathematical engine. You have been leasing it for $1 a year, and the rent is officially past due." The lead venture capitalist from Sand Hill Road slowly removed his glasses, looking at Landon and Gideon with immense coldness. The atmospheric shift in the boardroom was absolute. The investors did not care about Landon's emotional speeches or Gideon's corporate jargon. They cared about legal exposure and financial survival. They recognized immediately that investing $50 million into a company that did not own its core asset was financial suicide. "Is this legal assessment accurate, Taft?" the lead investor asked in a low, measured voice. "If we walk out that door right now, can this company legally operate its software platform tomorrow morning?" "Without a valid license from Mr. Miller," Taft conceded quietly. "Any continued operation of the core engine constitutes intentional copyright infringement. The company would face immediate injunctive orders." Gideon sank back into his chair, rendered entirely speechless. Landon looked around the table, desperately searching for support from his board, but found only cold hostility. "What are your terms, Mr. Miller?" the lead investor asked, turning his complete attention to me. I retrieved a newly drafted document from my briefcase, prepared by Clara Jenkins that very morning, and slid it across the mahogany table. "This is a comprehensive commercial licensing contract between Nexus Analytics Incorporated and my independent entity, Vance Logic LLC, I stated. "Under these terms, I grant the company a non-exclusive license to utilize the predictive engine. In exchange, Vance Logic LLC will receive 15% of all gross revenue generated by or derived from the engine, including all proceeds from Project Titan. This fee is payable quarterly. Furthermore, any attempt to reverse engineer, modify, or tamper with the underlying neural architecture will trigger immediate automatic termination of the license." 15% of gross revenue? Landon gasped, his voice trembling with outrage. "That completely destroys our operational margins. It eliminates our profitability metrics." "Then I suggest you instruct Gideon to write a replacement engine from scratch," I replied smoothly. Looking directly at the chief technology officer, he claimed to the engineering staff that he personally architected the base logic over a single weekend. "I am more than happy to revoke my license immediately and allow Gideon to deploy his proprietary solution before the Project Titan launch in 48 hours. Every eye turned to Gideon. He sat completely paralyzed, staring at the table, incapable of uttering a single word. Everyone in that room knew he could not construct a functional data pipeline if his life depended on it. "Sign the agreement, Landon," the lead investor ordered coldly. "Or we pull our capital, cancel the Series D funding round, and file a formal breach of duty suit against you before the market opens tomorrow." It took 45 minutes of painful negotiation for Landon to capitulate. With trembling hands, he executed the new licensing contract on behalf of Nexus Analytics Incorporated. The moment the signatures were finalized, the board initiated immediate executive action. Gideon Ross was terminated on the spot for gross professional incompetence and material misrepresentation. Landon Vance was stripped of all operational authority, relegated to a decorative figurehead role with zero control over corporate technology or strategy. I packed my laptop into my briefcase. I did not accept their frantic offer to become Chief Technology Officer with a massive salary package. I had zero desire to manage corporate politics or handle administrative headaches. I preferred absolute independence and pure passive revenue. I walked past the glass offices, past the corporate coffee bars, and out of the building into the crisp Boston air. 3 months have passed since that boardroom encounter. Nexus Analytics successfully finalized its modified funding round, though at a significantly reduced valuation due to the perpetual 15% gross licensing liability on their balance sheet. The Project Titan launch was an unqualified commercial success, processing tens of millions of transactions seamlessly. Because my core engine functioned flawlessly, Yesterday, the first quarterly licensing remittance arrived at Vance Logic LLC. The amount was extraordinary, more than enough to secure complete financial freedom for the remainder of my life. Occasionally, when their internal engineering team encounters a complex architectural edge case, they contact my private consulting firm, and I charge them $500 an hour to remotely resolve the issue. I now work from a quiet, spacious home office overlooking a serene landscape. There are no corporate buzzwords, no glass fishbowls, and no arrogant executives claiming credit for my labor. Just pure mathematics, clean code, and absolute autonomy. People in the business world frequently advise young professionals never to burn corporate bridges. It is flawed advice. Sometimes, you must set the bridge ablaze to remind people that they were only standing above the water because you built the structure beneath their feet. They believed I was merely an obscure employee, keeping the machinery running. They forgot that when you hold legal title to the power grid, you hold the power to turn off the lights. I took the licensing check to the bank this afternoon. As the teller processed the transaction, she looked at the figure in surprise and asked what line of work I was in. I operate in commercial real estate, I told her with a subtle smile. Oh, buying and selling properties? She asked. No, I replied calmly. I rent out fundamental logic to people who lack it.